Hi everyone, I'm Vanessa. I am a sixth-year PhD student in BGS at Penn. I'm also the intern in the Office of Research and Diversity Training, and today we are with Dominique, who did the summer undergraduate internship program at Penn, and that's how we know each other. So Dominique, if you can introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dominique Brooks. I'm a senior biology major currently attending University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm interested in pursuing my PhD in hopes to have a career as a research scientist.
Great. And so today, thanks Dominique for giving us like any advice that you might have on virtual interviews. We know you just went through some. And so to get us started, if you can tell us how you felt before the interview. And so this can be, like a week leading up, like the minute right before you signed on, like tell us how you were feeling.
Yeah, so I definitely was very, very anxious and totally nervous before the interview. I definitely was having a hard time sleeping the night before, thinking about, what questions the interviewer may ask. The morning of, so I had three interviews. All three of them were, well, sorry, two of them were in the afternoon and one was early morning. And my first one, luckily, was in the afternoon around 2 p.m. So I had time to sort of get up and prepare myself for the interview. But yeah, I think I definitely stopped like reviewing notes kind of like 20 minutes before the interview. And honestly, I just watched YouTube to calm my nerves right before the interview.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, there's only so much that you can do, like right before
Exactly.
you're signing on. And so, yeah.
Exactly.
Do you think that you felt less anxious as you had like your other interviews, like compared to your first one?
So I definitely felt less anxious compared to the first interview versus the last. I would also like to note for my first two interviews, the interviewers were late. So I guess that relieved some of the nervousness that I had, only because I felt like it was less formal in the fact that the interviewers, it kind of slipped their mind and it made me feel more like they were human, right? Because they're making a mistake.
Mhm.
And to some extent, I felt like they were just a little more empathetic, right? Because they were very late to the interview. So I felt that maybe they weren't going to be as harsh as they could have been on me.
Mhm.
And definitely for the last interview, since I had already did the two previous ones and I kind of already knew what to expect. Oh yeah, I was completely prepared for the last interview. I wasn't nervous at all. I was kind of like, okay, I'm ready to just get over it now. Yeah.
Nice. And so you said that the first two interviewers were 30 minutes late. Did you contact the program director to like let them know like that they were late and then hopefully they reminded the person or like you
Yes.
just waited? Okay.
Yes. So, so there was actually a program coordinator that emailed me
Hmm.
with scheduling the time and dates for the interview. So the first thing, after 5 minutes of the first interviewer being late, I wanted to make sure that I received the correct day, the correct time, and also the correct link. And so I immediately emailed her, and she quickly responded within 5 to 10 minutes, and she confirmed that I did have the right information. And she told me that she would contact my interviewer, and she was able to contact the interviewer, and they were able to tend to me. I think yeah, literally 30 minutes after. And luckily, my interviews weren't not back to back. And I scheduled my interviews during a time where I had no classes before or after, so I had time to continue the interview.
Yeah, that is actually a good point that you bring up and something that I think people should consider when they're scheduling these virtual interviews that yeah, things can happen and like Wi-Fi problems can happen. Yeah, you don't want it to have like classes like right, like scheduled
Right.
right after and
Mhm.
stuff. Um, yeah. And so kind of going off of that, it seems that, you had things figured out. And so how did you prepare then leading up to the virtual interview?
Yeah, so I was actually notified sort of a short notice of when my interviews are going to be. So prior to being notified exactly the day and time, I knew a week before my actual interviews that I was going to be interviewed. I just didn't know when.
Mhm.
So I actually was able to schedule a mock interview with a mentor of mine. And we went over potential questions that could be asked during the interview. And I sat down and I sort of typed out what my answers would be to those questions and really and how to verbalize those answers in the most concise and clear way.
Hmm.
And I just sort of went over those questions. In addition, I did read up on all of the interviewers' research. However, I didn't do an in-depth sort of like I didn't read any papers published by them. I sort of just read what was on their website, what was on the institution's website to get a broad idea of what their research is. And I did come up with a couple of research related questions for the interviewers, but nothing too specific. I literally just came up with questions because I interview people who I potentially would want to work with. So my
Hmm.
questions were really specific to, literally questions that I literally was interested in
Hmm.
because I want to work with them. Yeah.
Right. Okay, perfect. And so, yeah, going off of like the question, so then when they asked you questions, like was there a question that you felt the most comfortable answering, or the least comfortable answering?
Yeah, so the question that I felt the most comfortable asking was, every interviewer is going to ask, "Tell me about your research,"
Hmm.
and I'm very involved in my research and very well at explaining what I do, and of course I prepared for that as well,
Hmm.
prepared for how to explain my research in like a quick 5 minute or even less summary. So that was the easiest question to answer. In terms of the hardest question to answer, I would say one of the interviewers. So in your personal statement, right, you're going to express sort of what field you're interested in. And one of my interviewers actually asked me a specific question related to that field. So background, I'm interested in working with CRISPR and gene editing technology. And although I know I'm interested in that, my research currently is not in that field, right? So
Hmm.
it's not expected that I specifically know a lot of information about that field because, again, it's a field I'm interested in. But one of my interviewers did ask me a specific question about CRISPR.
Hmm.
And although I knew part of the answer, I did not know the entirety of the answer. Um, and so I just had to work with the information I got. And it seemed like he was pleased with the answer. So yeah, so my advice would be if you say you're interested in a specific field or topic, definitely read up on it just in case, right, you get a question related to that field.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and that person might also be interested in that field, and so they, yeah, will ask you things. But that's great that you did what you could with the question, and yeah, I'm sure that whatever you didn't know, you just said that you didn't know.
And the other two interviewers, we did have conversations about CRISPR, but um, I was able to, hold my own when we had the
Hmm.
conversation because I do know the very basics of the field.
Right. Perfect. And so, yeah, staying on like this like question thing. So, did you have one question that you asked all your interviewers, or did you have like how you were saying you had research specific questions? So if you can tell us a little bit, because at the end they ask you, right, like, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah.
And you should always have questions, right?
Right. So since my interviews were only 30 minutes and most of the time was taken up by me answering their questions and also
Mm-hmm.
them telling me about their research, I
Mm-hmm.
really only had no more than 10 minutes to have a conversation about the questions that I asked. So two of them I did ask research related questions, very broad. It was about I'm interested in gene editing, so I literally
Mm-hmm.
asked, how is gene editing or CRISPR implementing to your research? But the one question that I asked all my interviewers was, what keeps you up at night? What keeps you up at night? What about your job keeps you up at night specifically? And I think having a question that makes your interviewers think about it, having something that makes them think right then and there definitely makes them remember you, right? Because no one's
Mm-hmm.
gonna ask them. They probably have never come across somebody that asked them that before. So you really want to have sort of a question that makes them think. Another question that I had on my sort of thinking questions was I did ask one of my interviewers this is I asked something along the lines like if you had unlimited amount of resources, money, and time, what question would you ask, or what topic would you, what field of study would you go into other than what you're already studying currently? And again, something that makes them think, right? Makes them pause for a second, right, before they
Hmm.
answer you. Um, and I'm trying to think. I know I had another question that I had, but I can't think of it right now.
Yeah, don't worry. Those are actually really hard questions to
Mhm.
ask someone, right? So I feel like, yeah, that if someone gets asked that and they haven't thought about it, then they're like what you said, they'll think about it then and try to give you an answer, but it's gonna be a question that they'll keep thinking about during like at night.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and be
And
like, huh, what would I do with all the resources, you know?
yeah, and as we're talking about questions, I know those are questions I asked at the very end when they specifically said, "Do you have questions for me?" But I will say that, when they're talking about their research, make sure you find a pause while they're speaking to ask a question. And it can be any, it doesn't have to be anything, it does not have to be anything like so difficult and that
Hmm.
makes you look like a genius, but something as simple as asking them to define a term, right? Because you want them to know that you're listening. And by asking questions in the middle of them talking about their research, lets them know that you're actually interested in what they're talking about and their research, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's a really good point. Um, yeah. And so then do you have, so thinking about, right, like past you, right, or like people that are going through now that are going to go through like the virtual interview process, like do you have advice that you would give someone?
yeah, so I think the number one advice, other than some cliche advice like know your research. I definitely will say that body language and personality has a lot to do with whether or not an interviewer thinks you're a good fit for a program. And so, what I mean by that is whenever you're talking about your research or listening to someone else talk about research, you want to look like you're interested. And of course, I think you should be interested, right? If you want to be going into this field. So that shouldn't be hard, but like nodding, not excessive nodding, but
Mhm.
confirmation that you're listening, smiling, sort of making facial expressions that show you're enthusiastic about your research. If you're someone that uses your hands when you talk, that can also help, especially on a virtual setting. The interviewers probably enjoy seeing students that can sort of bring the screen to life as if they are talking in person. Um, and then the last piece of advice I would have is just try to be yourself, right? I think it's very easy for interviewers to spot out somebody that's sort of not being themselves. So, and I'm sure that's a very cliche piece of advice, but it's true, right? You want to be
Mhm.
yourself.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, right, they want to make sure that the person that wrote, right, like the personal statements is the person that's talking to them. And
Exactly,
so, yeah,
exactly.
it should be a conversation. Hopefully, they're not like grilling you. And so you have, this pleasant exchange of, like research, and just like about life. Yeah. Well, that was great. Thank you so much, Dominique.
Hmm.
And good luck with the rest of your interviews.
Thank you.
We'll stop recording.